Sydney Harbour, 1831. A whole bullock roasts on a massive spit. 12 sheep cook in succession. 4,000 people, convicts, emancipists, currency lads, the working poor, flood through the gates of a harbour-side estate to celebrate the downfall of a governor they hated. 4,000 loaves of bread, casks of gin brewed by ex-convicts, bonfires visible from Sydney Cove, and at midnight an illumination spelling out a message that could get you hanged. Down with the tyrant. 20 years later, in that same house, a woman sits alone in a drawing room decorated with crimson silk damask and elaborately carved rosewood. She's wearing pink silk. She looks, in every portrait, profoundly sad. Nobody comes to visit. The respectable families of Sydney will not set foot in her house. She is the daughter of convicts, married to the son of a convict, living in the most beautiful rooms money can buy. And she is dying of isolation. This is Vaucluse House, and its story is the story of every uncomfortable truth about Australian wealth that we prefer not to examine too closely. It's built on stolen Birrabirragal land that was never ceded, funded by the legal system that transported Irish knights for abducting heiresses, extended by the wealth of a man born to convicts who became one of the richest people in the colony, but could never, ever be accepted by good society. And it was never finished. The bedroom wing that was supposed to complete the mansion, never built. The family ran out of money during the 1840s depression, so the grandest house on Sydney Harbour is, architecturally, a fragment, a facade pretending to be whole. How does a knight convicted of abducting an heiress build the first house here and defend it with imported Irish soil? How does the son of convicts throw the biggest party in colonial history while his wife sits alone in empty rooms? And what happens when you try to build English aristocracy on land that rejects the entire premise? If you enjoy deep investigations into Australia's grand estates and the families who built them, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which property to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's begin with the crime that started everything. Before we talk about Sir Henry Browne Hayes and his bizarre crime, before we discuss William Wentworth and his social warfare, before we examine Gothic turrets and crimson silk damask, we need to establish what this land was before Europeans arrived, and we need to be precise about what happened here. This valley, the closed valley that gives Vaucluse its Latin name Vallis Clausa, sits on Birrabirragal and Gadigal country, the Dharawal and Gundungurra peoples. These are not abstract historical categories. These are specific family groups with specific knowledge of this specific place. Unlike the exposed sandstone ridges that define much of Sydney Harbour, this is a sheltered, moist valley with fresh water, dense vegetation that provided food, medicine, materials for tools, and shelter. Protected beaches where shellfish could be harvested. Rocky outcrops where fish could be trapped in tidal pools. This wasn't wilderness. This was a carefully managed landscape shaped by tens of thousands of years of deliberate burning, plant cultivation, and seasonal movement. The rock engravings are still there. You can see them on the exposed sandstone platforms within the estate boundaries. Sea creatures, human figures, geometric patterns whose meanings are held by descendants, not by archaeologists or filmmakers. The middens, shell deposits from tens of thousands of meals, are still visible along the foreshore, layer upon layer upon layer, each layer representing a season, a gathering, a family sharing food. These aren't artefacts, they're evidence of continuous occupation and care. On the 25th of February, 1793, Governor Phillip issued a Crown grant of 80 acres to Thomas Laycock, a quartermaster in the New South Wales Corps. Read that sentence again. Crown grant. The Crown, the British monarchy, granted land it didn't own to a soldier in an occupying military force. There was no treaty, no purchase, no negotiation with the Birabiragal or Gadigal peoples whose country this was. The legal doctrine was terra nullius, land belonging to no one. This isn't ancient history we're disconnected from. Every land title in Australia, including the one for Vaucluse House, traces back to this original legal fiction. The fiction that the land was empty, that it belonged to no one, that it was available to be granted by a foreign power. The New South Wales government now acknowledges Birabiragal and Gadigal custodianship of Vaucluse House. There are interpretation panels. There are acknowledgements in official literature. But acknowledgement without reparation, without treaty, without substantive change to who owns and profits from the land, that's still just words on a plaque. This documentary needs to be clear from the beginning. Every stone of Vaucluse House, from Hayes's 1803 cottage to Wentworth's 1840s Gothic additions to the 1917 turrets, was built on stolen land. That doesn't mean we can't appreciate the architecture. It doesn't mean we can't examine the human drama of the people who lived there, but it means we can't tell those stories as if they exist in a vacuum. The Birabiragal engravings predate Hayes's cottage by approximately 60,000 years. They predate the Gothic revival style by approximately 60,000 years. They'll probably outlast Wentworth's turrets by thousands more. The documentary's visual and narrative strategy should constantly remind viewers. The European history of this place is a brief, troubled interruption of a much deeper story. The sandstone remembers which history is real. Sydney sandstone is approximately 230 million years old. It was formed from ancient river deposits in the Triassic period. Human beings, Homo sapiens, have existed for about 300,000 years. Indigenous Australians have occupied this continent for at least 65,000 years. The British colony of New South Wales was established 232 years ago. The rock engravings carved into this 230 million-year-old stone by people who'd been here for 60,000 years are being interpreted by a colonial society that's been here for 232 years. This is about perspective, about understanding that European colonialism is, geologically and culturally, a very recent event. Brief, possibly temporary. The land remembers deeper time than colonial time. Now, the crime. Sir Henry Browne Hayes was not a common criminal. He was a Knight of Cork, a sheriff, a wealthy landowner in Ireland with an estate called Mount Vernon. He was also a widower with 4 children, and in 1797 he decided he wanted to marry Mary Pike. Mary Pike was a Quaker heiress. She was not interested in marrying Henry Browne Hayes, so he forged a letter. The letter, supposedly from a physician, claimed Mary's mother was deathly ill and dying. Mary rushed to her mother's side. Her coach was intercepted on the road by Hayes and a band of masked men. She was taken to Mount Vernon. A man dressed as a priest was waiting. Hayes intended to force a marriage ceremony that would give him legal access to her fortune. Here's the detail that tells you everything about Mary Pike's character. When Hayes produced the ring, she threw it across the room. Hayes threatened to shoot himself with a pistol if she didn't comply. She remained defiant. Hayes eventually fled. He lived as an outlaw for a period before being captured. He was tried and sentenced to death for abduction, but the sentence was commuted to transportation for life. He arrived in Sydney in 1802, a special convict with money and status. In 1803, Hayes purchased 2 land grants, the Laycock and Cardell properties, consolidating 105 acres in what was then extremely remote bushland, accessible primarily by water, and he named it Vaucluse, from the Latin Vallis Clausa, closed valley. This was a deliberate reference to Fontaine de Vaucluse in Provence, France, the famous retreat of the Italian poet Petrarch, who went there to write love sonnets in solitude after being rejected by his beloved. Do you see what Hayes was doing? He was reframing his narrative. He wasn't a criminal deportee. He was a romantic exile, a sophisticated European suffering in solitude like Petrarch, a man of letters and sensitivity, unjustly punished for following his heart. Between 1803 and 1805, Hayes built a small stone cottage ornée, a decorated cottage. And here's what's architecturally fascinating. That cottage is still there. It hasn't disappeared. It's been encased within the later mansion. The current drawing room, little tea room and dining room, those are Hayes's original cottage, absorbed into Wentworth's expansion like a Russian doll. The house is literally built in layers, each generation wrapping around the previous one. You're never looking at a single moment in time. You're looking at 1803, 1829, the 1840s and 1917 all stacked on top of each other. Now we get to the story that makes Hayes unforgettable, the snake legend. According to colonial law, widely reported in 19th century newspapers, Hayes was terrified of Australian snakes. He believed in the Irish legend that St. Patrick had banished all snakes from Ireland, and that Irish soil itself was a repellent to serpents. The story goes, Hayes imported 500 barrels of Irish peat and soil. He had them placed in a trench surrounding his cottage, a protective ring of Irish earth to keep the Australian reptiles at bay. Now, is this literally true? Probably not entirely. It was likely exaggerated in the retelling, but it was widely believed enough to be reported by novelist John Lang in 1859 and repeated in newspaper accounts for decades. And here's why the story matters, even if it's partly myth. It's a perfect metaphor for the entire colonial project. Bring Irish soil, bring English seeds, bring European architecture, build a trench, keep the alien landscape out, make this place be Ireland, be England, be anywhere but Australia. But the bush keeps growing back. The snakes were here first, and they're not going anywhere. Hayes received his pardon in 1812 and returned to Ireland. He left behind the cottage and the imported soil. The property passed to Captain John Piper, known as the Prince of Australia, for his extravagant spending and parties. But Piper's wealth was built on credit and customs duties, and when the credit dried up, he collapsed financially in 1827. Vaucluse went on the market, and that's when William Charles Wentworth saw his opportunity. William Charles Wentworth was born in 1790 on Norfolk Island. His father, Darcy Wentworth, was a surgeon who'd been accused of highway robbery 3 times in England. Never convicted, but the accusations followed him. His mother, Catherine Crowley, was a convict. In the rigid social hierarchy of the 1820s in Sydney, this made William Charles Wentworth untouchable. Literally. He could not marry into respectable families. He could not be received in the Government House drawing rooms. He was what they called tainted. But he was also brilliant. He studied at Cambridge. He was a barrister. He was a newspaper publisher, running the Australian, the colony's major opposition paper. He was an explorer. He'd crossed the Blue Mountains with Blaxland and Lawson, and he was becoming extraordinarily wealthy from pastoral holdings. By his death, he'd owned more than 200,000 acres. He was one of the richest men in the colony, but he couldn't get into the right parties. Then there was Sarah Cox. Sarah was born to parents who had been transported and convicted, but completed their sentences, making her a currency lass, born free in the colony. Before meeting William, she'd been engaged to a Captain John Payne, until Payne met a wealthier woman and abandoned Sarah. Sarah sued him for breach of promise, the first such case in colonial history. She won. Think about what that tells you about Sarah Cox. She wasn't passive. She wasn't accepting the humiliation quietly. She used the legal system, a system designed to oppress people like her, and she won. William and Sarah lived together at Vaucluse and had 2 children before marrying in 1829. This immoral arrangement, combined with her convict parentage, ensured Sarah was permanently excluded from polite society. While William fought in the Legislative Council, creating the Constitution for New South Wales, Sarah remained at Vaucluse, isolated, watching the harbour through Gothic windows. Wentworth purchased Vaucluse in 1827 for £1,500. He immediately began transforming Hayes's cottage into a Gothic revival mansion. Gothic, not Georgian, not classical. Gothic, the style associated with medieval castles, ancient lineage and aristocratic power. Precisely what Wentworth didn't have and desperately wanted. The construction happened in waves, 1828 to 29. He built the massive sandstone stables designed by George Cookney. These weren't just functional, they were architectural statements. Gothic arches, solid sandstone, permanent, impressive. 1829 to 30. Construction of the separate kitchen wing. This was a self-contained service block, physically separated from the main house. The batterie de cuisine, rows of copper pans hanging in precise order, was designed for industrial-scale hospitality. The 1830s. Addition of castellated turrets to the main house. Gothic detailing on windows and doors. Construction of the convict barracks to house the unfree labour building his mansion. Yes, convict barracks. On the estate. Because even in the 1830s, Wentworth was using assigned convict labour to build his Gothic dream. The 1840s, remodelling of the drawing room to launch his daughters into society. Crenellations added to the veranda, the house becoming more castle-like, more defensive, more aggressively Gothic. But here's what nobody mentions in the tourist brochures. The house was never finished. The intended bedroom wing, which would have completed the plan and provided proper private quarters, was never built. The 1840s depression hit. Money became scarce. Construction stopped. So they improvised. Wentworth's son, Fitzwilliam's room, is a partition in the upstairs corridor, a makeshift solution that became permanent. This is important because it reveals the truth beneath the facade. Even enormous wealth was precarious in colonial Australia. Even the richest families were one economic crash away from half-finished houses and improvised bedrooms. The grand facade is hiding a muddled, incomplete interior, just like Wentworth's social status, outwardly powerful, inwardly fragmented and unfinished. If you want to understand William Charles Wentworth's psychology, you need to understand the fate of October 1831. Governor Ralph Darling was finally leaving New South Wales. Darling represented everything Wentworth hated: the British imperial establishment, the exclusionary policies that kept currency people like him out of power. Wentworth decided to celebrate Darling's departure, publicly, aggressively, with a party that would dwarf anything the exclusives could imagine. He threw the gates of Vaucluse open to all grades of society. No restrictions, no class barriers. Convicts, emancipists, currency lads, the working poor, everyone was invited. 4,000 people came. In a Sydney that had a total European population of maybe 20,000. 20% of the entire city came to Wentworth's party. The logistics were staggering. A contemporary newspaper account from the Australian, Wentworth's own paper, described it. On an immense spit, a bullock was roasted entire. 12 sheep were roasted in succession. 4,000 loaves completed the enormous banquet. Casks of right strong beer and Cooper's gin flowed freely. The choice of Cooper's gin was political. Robert Cooper was an emancipist distiller, and serving his gin was a defiant middle finger to the import-dominated economy favoured by the exclusives. At 7 p.m, bonfires were lit on the highest hill of the estate, visible from Sydney Cove. Then came the illumination, a crown flanked by stars with 2 messages. God save the King, acceptable, loyal, proper. And below it, down with the tyrant. That phrase, down with the tyrant, was sedition. You could be transported for less. The Sydney Gazette, normally hostile to Wentworth, couldn't help but be impressed. The night being exceedingly fine, and the full orbed moon in all her majesty, an indescribable air of fascination was spread over the whole scene. The last lamp was lighted up amid deafening cheers. This wasn't just a party. This was a tribal gathering. This was the currency class, the emancipist class, the working class announcing, "We are here. We have power. We have wealth. And we don't need your approval." Wentworth was using food and spectacle to assert dominance where social etiquette had failed. But while 4,000 people celebrated outside, Sarah Wentworth was learning a different truth. The drawing room was remodelled in the 1840s with a specific strategic purpose: to launch the Wentworth daughters into society. The decor was museum quality: elaborately carved rosewood sofas and ottomans, crimson silk damask upholstery, floral wallpaper frieze, imported carpets. We know these details precisely because in 1853, when the family moved to Europe, they held a massive auction. The Sydney Morning Herald advertisement listed every piece: ottomans, sofas and easy chairs in elaborately carved rosewood, covered in crimson silk damask. That advertisement is the primary source modern curators use to reconstruct the room today. Contemporary accounts describe Sarah sitting in this room wearing pink silk, her expression reflecting the isolation she endured, while William worked in the library drafting a constitution. Because despite the crimson silk, despite the rosewood, despite the imported luxury, nobody came to visit. The respectable families of Sydney would not set foot in the house of the convict's daughter. Sarah could dress in silk. She could sit in the most beautiful room money could buy, but she could not buy acceptance. The drawing room was a stage set for a play that nobody came to watch. While Sarah sat alone in her crimson room, dozens of people made the estate function, and most of them had no choice about being there. The convict barracks housed the assigned labourers who built and maintained the estate. Under the assignment system, wealthy landowners like Wentworth could request convict workers from the government. These men and women weren't paid. They were property, temporarily loaned to private masters. They built the Gothic turrets. They laid the bricks. They dug the gardens. They maintained the stables. They made the estate function. And then, in the 1910s, the park trustees demolished their barracks. Too unsightly. Didn't fit the romantic Gothic fantasy they wanted to present to middle-class picnickers. Erase the workers. Keep the mansion. That's how heritage works when we're uncomfortable with the truth. But archaeology doesn't lie. Archaeological investigations and historical records suggest the material evidence of daily life among servants. Sewing pins and needles. Dozens of them. Evidence of clothing repairs done by hand in poor light after 14-hour work days. When your work dress tears and you can't afford a new one, you repair it yourself by candlelight. Buttons. Brass military buttons, suggesting convict uniforms. Bone buttons from servants' clothing. Simple wooden toggles. Each one representing a moment when someone sat in a cramped dormitory and sewed their coat closed. Food scraps. Mutton bones with knife marks showing how thoroughly they were stripped of meat, shell middens from oysters, cheap protein harvested from the harbour. Fish bones. But here's what's significant. These food scraps were found in the dormitory, underfloor spaces. Not in the kitchen, not in designated eating areas, hidden under the floorboards of sleeping quarters. The servants were hiding food. Think about what that means. You're so hungry or so uncertain about your next meal that you're hiding scraps under your bed. You're eating illicitly, away from the surveillance of the housekeeper who controls every aspect of your life. Tiny acts of rebellion, small reclamations of autonomy in a system designed to strip you of both. Clay pipes, cheap tobacco pipes, broken and discarded. Tobacco was one of the few legal pleasures available to convicts and servants. These pipes represent stolen moments, 5 minutes behind the stables, a brief escape from labour into the mild narcotic comfort of cheap tobacco. Meanwhile, upstairs in the kitchen wing, the batterie de cuisine hangs in perfect order. Rows of copper pans immaculately maintained. Professional, industrial. This kitchen had to produce 3 meals a day for the family. Multiple courses, European standards, separate meals for servants, simpler, cheaper ingredients, rations for assigned convicts, basic, minimal. Large-scale entertaining, the 1831 fete, wasn't a one-time event. Wentworth hosted regularly. The scale of labour this represents is staggering. Someone had to keep those fires burning from 5 a.m. until midnight. Someone had to scrub those copper pans until they gleamed. Someone had to pluck the chickens, gut the fish, knead the bread, churn the butter, preserve the fruits. And none of them could afford to eat what they prepared. Here's what haunts me about the archaeological record. We have the buttons, the bones, the pipes. We have physical evidence of these lives, but we don't have most of their names. Assignment records are incomplete. Servants often weren't listed in census documents. They were just household staff, enumerated as a number rather than as individuals. We know Wentworth had assigned convicts. We know he employed servants. But who were they? Mary, Thomas, Elizabeth. Were they Irish, English, Aboriginal women doing domestic labour, Chinese workers who'd stayed after the gold rushes? We know they existed. The archaeology proves it, but their names, their stories, their interior lives, largely lost. And this is the fundamental violence of systems like assignment and domestic service. They're designed to make people functionally invisible. You see the labour, the clean floors, the cooked meals, the maintained gardens, but you don't see the labourer. They become ghosts in their own lifetimes, present but unacknowledged, essential but erased. Just like Sarah Wentworth upstairs, actually. Different class, same invisibility. The estate aimed for complete self-sufficiency. The kitchen garden wasn't just functional, it was a display of technological mastery over the environment. Pineapples? In Sydney? In the 1840s? Pineapples were the ultimate status symbol in Georgian and Victorian England. Impossibly expensive, requiring elaborate hothouses and constant care. Growing them in Australia and serving them at your table was a power move. Melons, custard apples, cherimoyas. The garden produced luxuries that announced we have the technology, the labour and the capital to make European fantasies grow in Australian soil. The estate had a cooling room, an ice house. Ice in Sydney before refrigeration. This meant harvesting ice from mountain regions, transporting it, storing it in underground chambers insulated with sawdust. Also, the Wentworths could serve chilled champagne and wobbly whimsy jellies at dinner. Research by Cook and the Curator has reconstructed actual dishes served at Vaucluse, mock turtle soup made with calf's head, elaborate jellies that required hours of clarification, multi-course dinners requiring coordination of dozens of cooking processes. Think about the invisible labour this represents. The cook who had to start preparing dinner at dawn, the scullery maids who scrubbed the copper pans, the convict labourers who harvested the pineapples in glasshouses that were stifling in summer. While Sarah sat isolated in crimson silk upstairs, these workers lived in cramped quarters, worked 16-hour days, and were paid little or nothing if they were assigned convicts. The luxury upstairs required exploitation downstairs. This is the truth that heritage sites struggle to acknowledge. While Sarah suffered in the drawing room, William worked in the library. This is where he drafted the Constitution for New South Wales. In 1853, Wentworth chaired the committee to create a framework for colonial self-government. This was his life's work, getting the British Empire to give the colonies a voice. But here's where Wentworth's psychology gets complicated and dark. Wentworth proposed a two-chamber parliament, a lower house elected by property owners, somewhat democratic, though limited to those with wealth. an upper house of hereditary peers, a colonial aristocracy. The man who'd thrown the populist fate of 1831, who'd championed the currency and emancipist classes, was now proposing a system that would entrench a permanent aristocracy. And of course he'd be among the first peers created. The proposal was savaged. The most memorable attack came from Daniel Dennehy, a young politician with a gift for rhetoric. He called Wentworth's proposed peerage a bunyip aristocracy, the bunyip being a mythical indigenous creature, a made-up monster. I have seen such incongruous things. I have seen a turtle with a shark's head, and a bird with an alligator's tail. But I will never expect to be favoured with the spectacle of a Baron of Newtown, or a Count of Darlinghurst. The mockery was devastating. The idea of a convict-descended colonial duke was absurd. You couldn't manufacture aristocracy in Australia any more than you could make Australian snakes respect imported Irish soil. So what happened to William Charles Wentworth between 1831 and 1853? How did the man who celebrated with 4,000 emancipists become an arch-conservative trying to create the very class system that had rejected him? Here's my reading. Wentworth spent his entire life trying to prove he deserved to be accepted by the exclusives. And when they kept rejecting him, when even enormous wealth and political power couldn't get Sarah invited to their parties, he decided to create a new system where he'd be at the top by law. If they wouldn't make him an aristocrat, he'd make himself one. But you can't escape your origins through legislation. The stain was never going to wash off, no matter how many turrets he added to his house. In 1853, the Wentworths left Australia for Europe. They'd never live at Vaucluse again. The auction was massive. Every piece of furniture, every carpet, every piece of crimson silk damask sold to the highest bidder. The house was leased to John Hosking. The lease agreement required him to maintain the park, gardens, orangeries, vineyard. But without the Wentworths, Vaucluse became a shell, a stage without actors. William Charles Wentworth died in England in 1872. His body was returned to Sydney for the first state funeral in New South Wales history. Think about that. The man who couldn't get into Government House drawing rooms received a state funeral. Massive crowds of official mourners followed the hearse, with spectators lining the entire route from Sydney to Vaucluse. An unprecedented public funeral for someone who'd been rejected by polite society. In death, he finally got the acknowledgement he'd craved in life. But by then it didn't matter. Sarah commissioned the Mansfield brothers to build a Gothic mausoleum on a rocky outcrop of the estate. It's consecrated ground. It houses the remains of William, Sarah and their children. It sits under a towering rock escarpment, blending the imported Gothic stone with the native Australian bush. And it sits on Birrabirragal land. The man who fought for colonial self-government is buried on land that was never legally ceded by its traditional owners. That's the final irony of William Wentworth. Even in death, his monument is built on stolen ground. In 1910, the New South Wales government resumed Vaucluse House for a public park. And then something interesting happened. The trustees began sanitising the history. They demolished the unsightly convict barracks. They tore down the workers' cottages. They erased the physical evidence of the unfree labour that built the estate. In 1917, they added new turrets to the eastern facade to make the house look symmetrical, to make it look complete. Those turrets are a 20th century fabrication. They're architectural fiction. The trustees wanted a picturesque Gothic castle for middle-class Sydney families to picnic near. They didn't want the incomplete, asymmetrical, convict-stained truth. This is fascinating as a meta-narrative about how we construct heritage. The perfect Gothic house tourists see today is partly a lie. It's 1803, 1829, the 1840s and 1917 all pretending to be a unified vision. It never was unified. It was always fractured, incomplete. improvised, just like the Colonial project itself. Local legend says Sarah Wentworth haunts Vaucluse House. Sightings describe a figure in period dress on the staircase, a woman gazing from the upper windows, looking out at the harbour. Now, I'm not going to tell you whether I believe in ghosts, but I'll tell you this. Whether or not Sarah's literal ghost walks these rooms, she was already a ghost during her lifetime. She was present, but unacknowledged by the society she desperately wanted to join. She existed in this house, in these beautiful rooms, but she was invisible to polite Sydney. The ghost story, real or imagined, is a metaphorical truth. Sarah was haunting her own life. A 1911 short story by Ella Macfadyen, The Goblin of Vaucluse, tells of children encountering a leprechaun and the ghost of Sir Henry Browne Hayes in the gardens on St. Patrick's Day. This reflects the persistent Irish influence of the estate's founder, the man who surrounded his cottage with imported peat to ward off Australian snakes. The story captures something true about the estate. It has always felt liminal. European, but not European. Australian, but refusing to be Australian. A closed valley where different times and cultures collide, but never fully integrate. If Vaucluse House is haunted, it's not haunted by supernatural entities. It's haunted by the Birrabirragal people, whose land was taken and whose engravings still mark the stone. The convicts who built the walls and were then erased from the official history. The servants who worked 16-hour days in the kitchen and slept in crowded quarters. Sarah Wentworth, who sat in silk and died of isolation. William Wentworth, who built a castle to prove his worth and never convinced the people he wanted to impress. These are historical ghosts, memories embedded in the architecture, stories the building refuses to forget, even when we try to sanitize them. Stand back from Vaucluse House. Look at what's actually preserved here. In the sandstone, indigenous rock engravings that predate the mansion by 60,000 years. In the foundations, Hayes's 1803 cottage, built by a convict knight with imported Irish soil. In the walls, William Wentworth's Gothic fortress, incomplete and improvised, built to impress people who never came. In the garden, exotic plants maintained by convict labour, announcing mastery over an environment that never fully submitted. In the drawing room, crimson silk and empty chairs, waiting for visitors who never arrived. In the turrets, 1917 fabrications, completing a symmetry that was never there. Every layer tells the same story, the desperate colonial desire to be something other than what you are, to be English when you're Australian, to be aristocratic when you're convict-born, to be accepted when you're permanently stained. I keep coming back to the image of Sarah at the window. This was the most beautiful prison in Sydney. The harbour view is stunning. The rooms are exquisite. The grounds are carefully maintained. But Sarah couldn't leave. Not really. If she went to Sydney, she wouldn't be received. If she stayed at Vaucluse, she was alone. Today, tourists walk through these rooms and admire the architecture. They take photos of the turrets. They picnic on the lawns. But how many of them think about Sarah, sitting in this exact spot, watching boats cross the harbour, waiting for a social acceptance that would never come? Vaucluse House asks us uncomfortable questions about Australian identity. Can you build legitimacy through architecture? Can Gothic turrets erase convict origins? What do we do with heritage sites built by unfree labour on stolen land? Why do we sanitise the history, demolishing convict barracks, adding fake turrets to make the past more palatable? And the hardest question, is isolation the price of ambition in a society built on exclusion? William Wentworth got rich. He got powerful. He helped write the Constitution. He got a state funeral. But he never got what he actually wanted, acceptance from the class that rejected him. Sarah got luxury. She got beautiful rooms and crimson silk. But she never got what she needed: community, companionship, social acknowledgement. The house gave them everything except what they were actually seeking. I said at the beginning that this house was never finished. The bedroom wing was never built. The Gothic vision was never completed. But maybe that's the most honest thing about Vaucluse House. Australia was never finished either. We're still improvising, still making makeshift partitions in corridors and calling them bedrooms, still building facades that pretend to be whole while hiding fragmented interiors, still trying to reconcile Indigenous dispossession with national identity, still trying to reconcile convict origins with aspirations to respectability, still trying to reconcile brutal environmental exploitation with our claimed love of the land. And beneath all of it, the sandstone remembers. The Birrabirragal land remembers. The 60,000-year story continues, whether we acknowledge it or not. Vaucluse House isn't a monument to success. It's a monument to the things money can't buy: belonging, acceptance, completion, reconciliation. It's a beautiful prison, and it's still standing, asking the same questions it asked when Sarah sat at that window. What is this place? Who belongs here? And what price do we pay for trying to be something we're not? That's the story of Vaucluse House. That's the story of Australia. Thank you for watching this investigation into Vaucluse House. If you found value in this deep dive into one of Sydney's most complex heritage sites, please support this channel through likes, subscriptions, and comments. Tell me which Australian estate you'd like to see explored next. These documentaries require weeks of research and production. Your engagement makes them possible. Until next time, keep asking questions about the buildings around you. Keep wondering who built them, who paid, who suffered, and what truth the architecture is trying to conceal.